I think the main cause, is the broader cultural devaluation of book reading. The idea of the death of the author, the idea that you no longer needed to bother too much about what the author might have intended, it was meant to sort of liberate readers. I'm actually going to start with a paradox. Literacy levels in the UK are at historical highs. According to the international tables on these things, the UK is sort of round about sort of the top, or sort of close to the top. At the moment, we're really, really good at reading, it seems. It's a source of national pride, perhaps even greater than our football team, in fact. So as I said, we're really, really good at reading things, perhaps in the most functional sense. Really good, that is, at kind of decoding and making sense of those alphabetical symbols that we're surrounded by. Young people, it seems, young Brits certainly, and it goes for all Western kids. They just can't get enough of text at the moment. I don't just mean the endless messaging and scrolling and so on. Many young people now watch, and this is one of the most curious kind of cultural sort of phenomena of our time. Young people tend to now watch videos, films, streaming videos with subtitles and captions on. They're now literally reading audio-visual media. So they're completely surrounded by text. Yet at the same time as literacy levels are really high, at the same time as reading, at the same time as sort of young people, at the same time as Brits seem to be reading a lot, survey after survey shows the same thing, that fewer and fewer people are reading for pleasure. Indeed, fewer people are reading books, certainly to the end. Thanks to the existence of Kindles and e-books, we now know to what extent books are actually completed. I think it's one of my favourite sort of contemporary factoids. Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century is the most bought non-fiction book, and it's also the least read non-fiction book. It looks good on the shelf, and in fact, that's often where it stays. So right now, we've never been as literate as we are right now, and we have never read so few books, it seems. We've never read so little for pleasure, for illumination, indeed, for something other than the acquisition of information. In the terms of Frank Furedi's book on the subject, which inspired today's conference, reading, I think, has rarely been as powerless as it is right now. And I think we need to reckon with the growing powerlessness of reading. Now, the easy answer, I think, is always to blame new media, blame new technologies. They're always being blamed. The 1920s, Virginia Woolf, great literary modernist, she was moaning about the cinema. She thought that was going to wipe out reading, wipe out books, because the literate masses, would just be too tempted by the unrefined pleasures of cinema. Fast forward 70 years, Susan Sontag, writing in the 1990s, remember this was the era of kind of dial-up internet still, car phones, not smartphones. She was worried that the internet, in her words, was turning books into an endangered species. And again today, we get the same kind of sort of blaming of technology. The main explanation, I think, given for the decline in book reading, the decline in the kind of reading for pleasure culture, is the rise of smartphones, social media, etc. Now, I think this kind of technology blaming is a form of displacement activity. It's a way of kind of projecting anxiety about sort of social cultural changes onto new media. Because I don't think the growing powerlessness of reading, the decline in reading for pleasure, I don't think that can be attributed to the rise of TikTok. I think the main cause, is the broader cultural devaluation of book reading. The increasing sense that books, especially great books, have anything really to say to us today. I think the main problem is the fact that literary traditions, national or otherwise, have been slowly deprived of cultural authority. The aura, if you like, the aura of books as repositories of kind of great spiritual or intellectual value has waned significantly, I think, over the past few decades. And as a result, the impulse to turn to a book is withering with that. Why bother almost with an activity that seems so pointless, that seems so culturally devalued? This is quite a shift, I think. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, literature had a kind of secularized but almost sacred character. Hence, there was a canon of literature, a changing list of culturally celebrated books, poetry, and plays that carried an absolute authority within a given, often national community. They were seen as sources of meaning, sources of almost spiritual value beyond the workaday world. As that great kind of British Victorian educationalist Matthew Arnold had it, the great works of literature, famously the best that has been thought and said in the world, they were valued precisely because, in his words, they turned a fresh stream of thought on our stock notions and habits. That is, they allowed for the cultivation of the whole personality, as Matthew Arnold had it. Or as Frank actually describes in The Power of Reading, book reading was seen as crucial to the cultivation of one's sense of self. It would thwart our sort of previous held assumptions. In Matthew Arnold's word, it would turn a fresh stream of thought on our stock notions and habits. But this sense of the value of literature, its canonicity, if you like, has come under increasingly sustained assault in recent decades. Interestingly, it's principally come under sustained assault from within academia itself. In the 1960s and 70s, for instance, you had English lecturers who were meant to be sort of promoting and advocating literature, who were meant to sort of appreciate the sometimes sublime value of great works of literature. You had them sort of actively devaluing it. You had them talking about decentering the text, to use some of the jargon of the time, of hailing the death of the author, to use the name of the famous Roland Barthes essay. The idea of the death of the author, the idea that you no longer needed to bother too much about what the author might have intended, it was meant to sort of liberate readers. It was meant to sort of liberate critics as well, to be able to kind of turn even great works of literature, to read them against the grain, to kind of criticize them for being perhaps too supportive of the capitalist status quo, for perhaps supporting and maintaining the oppression of women and so on. So it was seen as this kind of liberatory moment. But I think the death of the author, I think that kind of, I'm using that as a shorthand for a kind of academic moment, also represented something else as well. I think it represented the death of the book's authority. It marked the point at which a work of literature, philosophy, and so on was slowly divested of its power. It ceased to be a work of anyone in particular. It just, sorry? 1 or 2 minutes. It ceased to be a work of anyone in particular and just became a text. It ceased to be a work, it became a text. It just became a grist to the clever critic's mill. And I think that process of the deauthorization of literature has only accelerated in the decades since. Increasingly today, I think once canonized, great books are not only treated as objects for sort of deconstruction and so on by this or that school of criticism, be it post-colonial or quasi-Marxist or whatever it is, queer, they're now partially demonized as well. They are treated as the worst that has been thought and said in the world. They're attacked precisely to the extent that they challenge today's stock notions and habits. They're demonized precisely to the extent that they kind of challenge sort of current contemporary mores. They are slapped with trigger warnings and so on. They're seen as too dissenting from the current consensus. So given the elite turn against literary traditions, canons, even the idea of great books, is it any wonder, I think, that fewer and fewer people think it worthwhile to read a book, especially a great one, for pleasure or for illumination or for enlightenment? We decode and process, I think, text more competently than arguably at any point in history, and at the same time, fewer and fewer people actually believe in the power of literature. Young people are choosing not to study it at school, and some universities in the UK are now shutting down literature courses. Upbeat note, I'm going to end on an upbeat note, because I suddenly realised I've just mounted a sort of Jeremiad against a sort of contemporary culture. I think the kind of elite turn against literature, the move to warn readers of the dangerous and sometimes triggering content contained even within Shakespeare, I think that's almost at the same time a backhanded tribute to literature's potential power. It simply needs enough people, I think, willing to defend that power.